Well, good morning and welcome back to another episode of the League of Biblical Enthusiasts. Last week we discussed Robert Curzon, who visited a number of Orthodox Greek monasteries throughout the Middle East. He acquired a number of these older Greek and Syriac manuscripts while he visited Greek Orthodox monasteries in Egypt, the monasteries of Mount Athos in Greece, and even the Marsaba Monastery near the Dead Sea. Today we begin another manuscript hunter, perhaps one of the most famous, and it was a contemporary of Curzon, that being Constantine Tischendorf. We'll have 2 episodes on Tischendorf. His full name is Lobgott Friedrich Constantin von Tischendorf. He was born January 18th, 1815, in Langenfeld, Saxony, Germany, and he died December 7th, 1874, in Leipzig, a year after Curzon passed away. Tischendorf is primarily known for his discovery of the Codex Sinaiticus, the oldest and most complete Bible, dated to somewhere in the middle of the 4th century. And we'll cover that discovery in our next episode. Today we focus mainly on his early life and academic career. He's been recognized as a New Testament manuscript hunter, theologian, textual critic, and paleographer. He even composed a volume of poetry in 1839. He was friends with composers Robert Schumann and Felix Mendelssohn. Just let us now begin and take a look at his early years in academics. He was born the son of a physician, and he was the 9th of 11 children. He received a sound foundation in Latin and Greek in the Gymnasium in Plauen, Germany in 1828. Gymnasium is basically an academic high school. While studying theology at the University of Leipzig from 1834 to 1838, he was heavily influenced by his New Testament Greek professor, Johann Weiner. And Weiner impressed the young Tischendorf with the vision for improving the current state of the Greek New Testament, since many manuscripts were now coming to light. During Tischendorf's time, the New Testament was based on relatively few and late Greek manuscripts dated from the 10th to the 12th centuries that were used by Erasmus and Luther and the translators of the King James Bible. It became Tischendorf's life quest to establish a firmer basis for the New Testament text based on much earlier manuscripts. He received his doctorate in philology at Leipzig in 1838 at the age of 23. He was then accepted to a tutoring job in the house of Reverend Ferdinand Zeme in Grostendel, where he met and fell in love with the clergyman's daughter, Angelica. They were soon engaged, but were married only 5 years later in 1845, because Tischendorf spent those years abroad in Paris, in England, Italy, Malta, Egypt, the Sinai Desert, Jerusalem, Beirut, Constantinople, and he devoted himself to those manuscript discoveries, translations, and research. He was appointed a privatdozent, or assistant professor of sorts, in the University of Leipzig, a position he held from 1840 to 1845. In 1859, he became professor of theology at the University of Leipzig, a position he held until his death. Side note, a philosopher you might be familiar with was once a student of Tischendorf and attended some of his classes. That would be Friedrich Nietzsche, whose interest at the time was philology. Tischendorf was also awarded 2 honorary doctorates, both in 1856, one from Oxford, one from Cambridge, in recognition of his outstanding work in textual criticism and manuscript discoveries. In May of 1873, Tischendorf had the first of several strokes, from which he never fully recovered. Some think that he literally worked himself to death, to an early death, due to his constant and tireless attention to his manuscripts. He died in 1874 in Leipzig and left behind his wife and children and his library of some 3,000 books, containing many rare volumes, the bulk of which was left to the University of Leipzig. He possessed the first edition of both Erasmus' translation and Luther's translation. He and his wife Angelica were buried side by side in a cemetery in Leipzig, and his wife Angelica outlived him by almost 30 years. Let's now move on to a study of the most important results of his scholarly career. In his book, The Romance of Bible Scripts and Scholars, John Roman breaks down Tischendorf's work into three defining cases. Number one, the case of the hidden writing. Number two, the case of the guarded codex. And number three, the case of the missing manuscript. And we'll follow these three cases for the remainder of these two episodes. Before we begin with the case of the hidden writing, I want to discuss for a moment Tischendorf's motivation for his work. Whereas Curzon was certainly an avid collector of antiquities, Tischendorf has a more apologetic motive. When I read Curzon's travel diary, I don't get a feel that he was especially motivated by a desire to find those manuscripts out of his love for the Christian religion. Now, do not doubt his faith, his commitment, but his drive to find those ancient manuscripts doesn't appear to be anything more to me than his scientific curiosity for ancient artifacts. On the other hand, Tischendorf had explicitly apologetic interests, and that is to set the foundation of the Christian faith on a surer footing by finding the most ancient New Testament manuscripts possible. Just as Curzon wrote a diary of his travels and visits to the monasteries of the Levant, Tischendorf did the same with his Travels in the East, published in 1847, and it breathes with personal devotion and religious feeling. The 19th century was witnessing a new set of challenges to the Christian faith by critics, especially German scholars. Tischendorf was an avowed evangelical, and he firmly believed in the historicity and truthfulness of the scriptures. In 1835, David Friedrich Strauss had published his Life of Jesus Critically Examined, in which he dismissed the Gospels as made-up myths. In 1840, Bruno Bauer began to promote his views that the original Gospel did not appear until the early 2nd century, and that Paul's letters were forgeries made in the latter half of the 2nd century. Ferdinand Christian Bauer, a German theologian and founder of the Tübingen School, proposed in an 1845 book on Paul that Paul's letters were written much later than traditionally believed, and he counted only 4 of Paul's letters as authentic, the rest being forgeries. Ernest Renan, a French biblical scholar who lived during Tischendorf's day, published a work in 1863 entitled Life of Jesus. This work has remained in print for the last 161 years, and Renan depicted Jesus as only a man, not as God, and he rejected the miracles related in the Gospels. This was the intellectual climate in certain German and French universities during Tischendorf's day, and these teachings were filtering down from the universities into more mainstream thought. Tischendorf's work was in part a response to the growing influence of these critical scholars. So by uncovering and studying ancient manuscripts, he aimed to bolster the historical reliability of the text and to counter those current thinkers. He wrote to his fiancée Angelica in 1842, and I quote, "Before me lies a sacred life task, a struggle for the original form of the New Testament." And later in life, Tischendorf reflected upon the various forms of praise he'd received over the course of his career, and he had this to say: But that which I think more highly of all than these flattering distinctions, such as a letter of congratulation from the Pope, honorary doctorates from Cambridge and Oxford, is the fact that Providence has given to our age, in which attacks on Christianity are so common, the Sinaitic Bible, to be to us a full and clear light as to what is the real text of God's Word written, and to assist us in defending the truth by establishing its authentic form. So now that we've established his motivation for his life's work, let's begin with the first of his scholarly career successes, the case of the hidden writing. At the age of 25, armed with a meager grant from the Saxony government and additional money from his brother, Tischendorf set out on October 30th, 1840 to Paris, where he would spend 3 years from 1840 to 1843 working on several manuscripts. His great challenge was to be Codex C, which is a palimpsest. And of course, as we described earlier, a palimpsest is a manuscript that had been used more than once after someone scraped off the outermost layer to make way for a new text and thereby obscuring the text underneath. Catherine de' Medici brought Codex C to France, part of her dowry, and from the Bourbon Royal Library it made its way to rest in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, where it still resides. This Codex C, as it was known then, is now known to us as Codex Ephraemi Rescriptus. It's one of the 4 primary unsealed manuscripts of the New Testament that join Sinaiticus, Alexandrinus, and Vaticanus. Earlier in its history, a scribe or monk found the topmost text would be better used to make way for sermons by a Syrian monk named Ephraim, and hence the name of the Codex, Codex Ephraemi. The director of the Paris Library believed no one would ever be able to decipher the underlying text. In fact, several scholars had tried and failed. Yet Tischendorf, with his excellent eyesight, attention to detail, his knowledge of Greek paleography, took the case to task, and over the period of 2 diligent years, deciphered the Old and New Testament underlying text to 99% completion. The New Testament text dates from the 5th century. His results have proved to be remarkably accurate, and he published his findings and found that the doors of libraries all over Europe were suddenly opened to him. In London and Oxford, Cambridge, Utrecht, Basel, and a half dozen Italian towns, Tischendorf pored over manuscripts and set up a program for publishing his results. He went on to work on a critical edition of the Greek Old and New Testament, as well as New Testament Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. His discoveries and translations and insights had become known to the scholarly world, and it would bring him much welcome recognition. His next challenge was the case of the guarded codex. In 1842, Tischendorf had his first contact with what might be called the least successful of these 3 cases. Scholars knew that in the Vatican archives rested an extremely important copy of the Old and New Testament called Codex B, known to us now as Vaticanus for obvious reasons. The manuscript was locked away in the Vatican archives and very difficult to examine, despite the Pope's goodwill to Tischendorf. It's not so much a Catholic hostility against Protestants, but for a different reason. Cardinal Angelo Mai had prepared an edition of the Codex, which was sloppily done and rife with errors. He jealously kept scholars away from the Codex, fearing his poor workmanship would become known. Tischendorf was only allowed to see it for 6 hours spread over 2 days and under close supervision. Later in his life, after many successes, Tischendorf returned to Rome to try again and see Codex B, or Vaticanus. In 1866, he was allowed to spend 3 hours daily for 14 days with the manuscript. This is still an impossibly brief time to go over the 350 leaves. The best he could do was to copy quick notes and memorize the beginning lines on some 20 pages and reconstruct a short portion. His persistence and work on the Codex was later followed by the Vatican making a photographic reproduction in 1889. So maybe Tischendorf's diligence paid off in the end. But his most adventurous and rewarding work will be recounted in our next episode. So stay tuned next week for the case of the missing manuscript. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this short episode and maybe learned something along the way. I'll leave links to important resources for further study in the description box. And if you found this helpful, please like, subscribe, and share it with your friends. We'll see you next week for the conclusion to Tischendorf as a manuscript hunter, brought to you by the League of Biblical Enthusiasts.